Welcome everyone to the online symposium Art and Humanity, What is Possible? My name is Philippe Stoll. I'm the Senior Communication Advisor for the International Committee of the Red Cross. We are here today in the preparation of the exhibition and I'm joined by Julie. Hi Julie.
Hi Philippe, I'm Julie Enckell Julliard, Head of Cultural Development at HED Genève, the University of Art and Design. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. This is the third session of the online symposium. Every Tuesday afternoon in May, we explore the complex and fascinating relationship between art and humanitarian action, two fields of expertise which seldomly interact with one another.
Last week we exchanged with three leading experts on the question of engaging. Today we'll have three pre-recorded sessions and we will follow this by a live Q&A, so stay tuned.
Today the theme is looking. How can artists and humanitarian workers help one another and ourselves change perspective? We will start with Dominique Laleg, postdoctoral research fellow, Bibliotheca Hertziana Max Planck Institute in Rome. In her paper, she will explore three arguments for and against an aesthetic of suffering.
Marc Herbst questions the way we associate and understand contemporary art and humanitarian crisis. He is an artist, editor, and researcher based in Germany and the US.
And finally, we will have Isabelle Delecourt. She will look at the chair as an artistic metaphor of absence and memory in the process of social and physical reconstruction. She is an art advisor based in Switzerland.
Today and throughout the fourth session, we are very pleased to be joined by Gilles Furtwängler, a Swiss artist, to co-create an artwork. He will join us for a 10-minute creative session. The artwork will consist of a co-authored text which will be published later this year along with the symposium papers.
Gilles Furtwängler is an artist who uses performance, painting and graphic arts, as well as writing and reading. He has had numerous of exhibitions in Switzerland and abroad, and he's represented in Geneva by Galerie Scopia.
Before we get started, Julie and I would like to thank our partner in crime, Pascal Schmidt, the director of the International Red Cross Red Crescent Museum. I would also like to thank Pierre-Antoine Possat from the museum for the production and coordination of the symposium.
This symposium is the result of a partnership between the International Red Cross and Red Crescent Museum, the RCRC, the Geneva Red Cross, and HED Genève, the University of Art and Design. Thank you to all our partners for their enthusiasm and support.
It is now time to begin. So keep your question for the chat box, stay tuned, participate to the production of the artwork with Gilles Furtwängler and enjoy the symposium.
First, I want to thank you very much for the kind invitation. It's a great pleasure to be part of this. And I want to thank Pierre-Antoine especially for his kind support when it came to the production of this video and the organization of this event. There are a number of reasons why the depiction of suffering can support humanitarian intention and action. The three most obvious and referred to arguments are: first, information. Depiction makes human suffering visible to a wider audience. Second, empathy. The representation of human suffering can generate individual and collective empathy for the victims. And third, commemoration. The representation of suffering can commemorate the victims and their pain. While these three arguments are applicable to many contexts, they can and should be challenged. In questioning this approach, one claim that has often been brought up by culture pessimists is that an increase in images displaying violence can lead to a numbing response in the viewer. The result, rather than empathy, is something closer to indifference, and indifference rarely supports humanitarian interest. While this type of psychological argument is mainly used within the context of mass media, today I will be discussing an alternative field in which it is also relevant, that of aesthetics. The traditional discipline of aesthetics, I will argue, renders the question of depicted suffering in a very particular way. I will attempt to demonstrate this by showing examples from modern art, as well as employing a brief examination of 18th century aesthetics. I will then analyze the critique of such an aesthetic approach to suffering in order to locate the problem within the recent discussions, commonly referred to as identity politics. So let me start with a short anecdote. In summer 2014, I was invited to a preview of an art exhibition at the Kunstmuseum Basel. As part of a group of researchers, I attended a private tour of the solo show by American artist Charles Ray, who acted as our guide together with the art historian Michael Fried from Johns Hopkins University. On the tour, we came across his work Sleeping Woman from 2012. It's a life-size sculpture made out of cut steel. In describing the work, the artist explained us with great enthusiasm that he by chance came across a black woman sleeping on a public bench in Los Angeles and was motivated to photograph her. Ray would often comment on the sculpture in interviews in much the same way. For instance, in the New Yorker in 2015, he stated, quote, "Her sleep was geological. She slept like a mountain sleeps, unwakeable, with cars and trucks going by. When I got home 45 minutes later, I looked at the pictures and realized I didn't have enough. So I walked back and took some more. She hadn't moved. I think she's an incredibly beautiful woman." End quote. This work, which depicts a homeless black American woman sleeping on a public bench in LA, caused immediate discomfort in our group of scholars. It felt as if something political was inserted into the work of art as a result of his description, even though it was intended to be viewed and understood as something purely aesthetic. What is further striking is that Ray's approach is not a strictly formalistic one, but rather it involves the subject matter in a crucial way. Ray is not blind to the subject matter of the work. Rather is the subject matter crucial for his aesthetic judgment. In this concept of aesthetic judgment, the unwakeable sleeping woman on a public bench serves as a model for the viewer's absorption, by which he forgets about all economic and social conditions which shape the depicted figure and therefore his work in an essential way. It is this aesthetic mode, a particular way of perceiving an object, that questions the alliance of art and humanitarianism. Let me show you another example to clarify what I mean by aesthetic mode. The Galleria Civica d'Arte in Torino holds a sculpture entitled La Schiava from 1877. It's made by the Italian sculptor Giacomo Ginotti. The life-size work in marble depicts a naked woman whose right ankle and wrists are tied up with chains. She wears a headscarf which, together with her upper armband, was likely intended to accentuate her exotic origin. Her wrists hide her pubic area and she tries to cover her naked breasts with her arms. Let's have a quick look how contemporaries in Europe interpreted this piece of art in the 19th century. The authors and publishers Clovis Lamarre and Amédée Roux write in their publication for the 1878 World's Fair in Paris, quote, Nous n'avons pas sous les yeux un marbre insensible, mais de la chair vivante, dont tous les muscles semblent frémir à l'unisson. Jamais statuaire n'a plus parfaitement assoupli une matière rebelle, et cette œuvre bien conçue et bien exécutée. End quote. In this benevolent description, the aesthetic mode comes into play again. The double meaning of the term rebellious material places the callous marble of the sculpture in a direct relationship with the depicted subject, the living flesh and the trembling muscles of the slave. Here too, the authors are not blind to the political implications bound up with the iconography of the work. Yet they look at it from an exclusively aesthetic perspective. The two examples discussed so far illustrate how suffering is used as a subject matter for aesthetic practice. Thus, they demonstrate that the aesthetic mode is at risk, consciously or unconsciously, to look at the suffering from a very distant viewpoint, with less interest in the value of human life and its condition than in its beauty. As such, the aforementioned three arguments, which use information, empathy, and commemoration as a justification for display of violence, are barely applicable in the service of aesthetic mode. There is first no information about the identity of nor the reason for the suffering person. Second, instead of empathy, the viewer is encouraged to feel aesthetically pleased. And third, due to the lack of identification and empathy, commemoration is simply not possible. The question that I want to pursue is, what is it about the aesthetic mode that stripes bare the suffering subject from its humanitarian significance? My suggestion is that a historical concept of the aesthetic is responsible, namely the concept of the so-called disinterestedness of the aesthetic experience. Disinterestedness has a history that can be traced back to British aesthetics, very defined in the writings of Shaftesbury and Burke, and from there it enters into German philosophy, most famously in Immanuel Kant's work. I will focus on the Kantian conception of disinterestedness, which he develops in his critique of judgment, in order to establish how suffering is related to aesthetic experience. The title of the paragraph already formulates the basic argument. The liking that determines a judgment of taste is devoid of all interest. So interest is here defined in the same paragraph as, quote, the liking we connect with the presentation of an object's existence, end quote. Interest is therefore related to the existence of an object. This existence of the object is important because only its existence can affect the subject, as Kant says in the following paragraph. Quote, now that a judgment by which I declare an object to be agreeable expresses an interest in that object is already obvious from the fact that, by means of sensation, the judgment arouses a desire for objects of that kind, so that the liking presupposes something other than my mere judgment about the object. It presupposes that I have referred the existence of the object to my state insofar as that state is affected by such an object. End quote. Interest thus refers to an object whose existence produces a sensual effect on the body, something Kant refers to later as pathological. Having coffee or a hot shower, for instance, is something agreeable, as it is based on sensual bodily experience. As such, it comes with interest, and is therefore not to be confused with aesthetic pleasure, according to Kant. It's important to highlight that interest and its pathology are systematically excluded from the aesthetic judgment. Another quote: "Taste is the ability to judge an object or a way of presenting it by means of a liking or disliking, devoid of all interest." End quote. So unlike sensory judgment, aesthetic experience is free of any need for its object. Herein lies one origin of aesthetic autonomy. Aesthetic judgment is not only resistant to any concept or objective rule, so we can never argue on beauty, but also excludes the sensual effects, which cause the sensory judgment. This autonomous position of the aesthetic experience then leads to the well-known formula of the free play, in German das freie Spiel, between imagination and reason, in which, according to Kant, these cognitive capacities and finally the idea of freedom is affirmed. In regard to the problem of an aesthetic of suffering, I'd like to have a closer look at the role of suffering in Kant's aesthetic theory. We have so far seen that he clearly distinguishes between the disinterested aesthetic judgment and the interested sensory judgment. Kant makes clear that both can appear in different ways. The aesthetic can come to play first as positive, as a liking of an object, or second as negative, as a disliking of an object. Sensory judgment can also appear in two different ways. Namely, first as positive, as agreeable, and second, negative, as pain. So now it's needless to say that pain in Kant's aesthetic is completely hostile to aesthetic experience, because the experience of bodily pain can only come with the interest of overcoming that very same pain. Or in other words, I cannot enjoy my pain aesthetically because I want it to stop. This is no longer the case if the pain is not mine. The pain of another can become the object of aesthetic pleasure, and as I have shown, it can be looked at with disinterestedness. Interestingly, Kant's distinction between the suffering experience and the aesthetic experience returns within a currently popular challenge of aesthetic autonomy, namely the arguments of identity politics. Let me quickly explain with one last example. The painting Open Casket from 2016 by the US artist Dana Schutz triggered a critique of aesthetics. The painting depicts the body of Emmett Till, a black American boy brutally murdered in 1955. The boy was a victim of a racist act of violence, and the painting refers to the iconic photograph of the boy's body, disfigured by violence. While being exhibited in the Whitney Museum of American Art in 2017, activists and writers recognized an illegitimate aesthetic appropriation of experienced suffering that is shared by a particular group, namely Black Americans. They argued that the painting uses black pain as raw material and that black suffering has transmuted into profit and fun. If I understand their arguments correctly, they don't want to ban the subject matter of suffering generally from aesthetic practice. They rather demand that the aesthetic processing of certain subject matters be reserved exclusively for the concerned group. Following this argument, a reasonable aesthetic of the suffering would consist in the division of society into distinct communities with certain authorities on certain subjects, while traditional aesthetics left no space for particular interests connected to social reality and aimed for a pureness and autonomy of the arts. Identity politics is entirely focused on reality and the related identities. So, what conclusion can we take here? We can consider these discussed positions as two extremes which open a space for critical navigation, when trying to achieve humanitarian goals through art. It is a navigation between, on the one hand, making use of aesthetic autonomy, where everybody has access to any topic, no matter how delicate it is. On the other hand, the aesthetic processing of such topics has to respect the particular concerns by certain groups who are involved with the topic in a more intimate way. Under the banner of artistic freedom and artistic autonomy, the field of aesthetic has been able to ignore some moral standards that have become relatively normal in our world. The current social climate calls for more sensitivity when it comes to particular topics. I think if we truly believe in the capacity of art to achieve humanitarian goals, why not accept that there are a number of blind spots to it and work towards overcoming them? I leave it there and thank you very much for your attention.
Hi, my name is Marc Herbst. I'd like to thank you all for attending my lecture and thank the Red Cross and Red Crescent Museum for this very interesting context of a paper. I will be first introducing the paper, then turning on some slides, and yeah, and sit back and enjoy. This presentation looks at how contemporary art supports a dissociative cultural system that prioritizes fractured social and ecological relations and thus is at best structurally blind to humanitarian crises. It then points to ways in which artistic and cultural work actually confronts such disassociation within both crisis situations, but also within normal audience and art situations. I present a totalizing narrative connecting the development of a Western philosophy that grounds art history to systems at the heart of global humanitarian crises. Global imbalances in power that make weaker people essentially ineligible to determine the terms under which they can meaningfully live and die. That is, a global order grounded on colonial dispossession and its particular sexism and racisms. Critical of this world, I nevertheless do not think of anything as a closed book, and that the world around us does show that the good comes with the bad. So while I would say that on the whole, art is no check on global capitalism and governance's failures, I know this is just one story about art, and that there are other stories to tell about creativity and culture's capacities. Okay, I'm going to start sharing my slides now. Okay, and then open up my paper again. Dominant governance regimes, capitalism, sexism, and a bias for modern organizing structures has created a climate where humanitarian crisis seems to emerge out of nowhere and can be characterized as being more complex than they appear at first sight. In fact, all the different ways humans live are complex, whether we talk about indigenous and others who live in close contact with complex natural ecologies, or relatively wealthy Western people who simply live at the end of an incredibly complex logistical chain. The fact of modern life allows for distant lands and distant situations to just seemingly appear, as they do when we go to the market and get bananas from a plantation in El Salvador, and how we can easily Google pictures of those plantations. This ease does a lot to construct the non-sensibility of humanitarian situations. In their 2020 CARE manifesto, the CARE Collective write that the dependencies we have on others locally and globally are veiled by the capitalist idea of autonomy that values a male-coded ability to be totally careless and to ignore all who you pay and count on to support your lifestyle. For art's sake, We can find odd ways that Enlightenment philosophy is strangely concurrent with this perspective. In his Critique of Aesthetic Judgment essay that I was taught as a grounding document of Western aesthetic theory, Immanuel Kant prioritizes disinterested contemplation as the ideal way to consider what is beautiful. He counterposes his position against an Iroquois holy person's concept of beauty. He has the Iroquois sachem considering beauty to be what is the most useful or the most satisfying. Kant wants beauty to be something removed from any aspect of what is necessary or physically pleasing. He asks us to disassociate from our centered perception when we contemplate the world and its relations and embrace as beautiful some esoteric political construct as a governing aesthetic concept. Concurrently, throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, scientists and philosophers had joined or followed colonial excursions to map not only the earth, but also to study the plants and minerals and the humans who use them. Encyclopedias were revised to include new species and to remove folk knowledges, which had once been considered a part of what was also an essential part of how one should know nature. Instead, essential knowledge became that which could be repeatedly verified by male Europeans in the decontextualized laboratory. Friedrich Hegel's 19th century appreciation of a religious sculpture is instructive for how knowledge, beauty, and meaning became entangled in a sense of contextless abstraction. Here, describing how the sculptor achieves beauty by, quote unquote, stripping off the branches of root, stripping off the traces of root, branches, and leaves, still adhering to the form, and purifies the latter into shapes in which the crystals, straight lines, and flat surfaces are raised to incommensurable ratios, so that of understanding and, at the same time, its essential nature, incommensurability, is preserved for the understanding. By the 20th century, with the world mapped and colonial empires falling away, Western military force has seemingly receded as global corporations dominate trade routes into every interior. What remains is dispossessed people or structures that normalize dispossession in the name of companies and logistics and connections to global law. Laws that are never able to end the use of, for example, Congolese rare earth metals and blood diamonds, despite the fact that the police and courts are funded and held up as models for civilization. Post-colonial scholars note that besides this violence and laws are knowledges and cultural systems that devalue other ways of knowing and being in this world besides. Environmental historian Jason W. Moore describes our capitalist system, saying that like any other life-supporting system, it works through nature to fulfill human need. As an ecological historian, he traces how humans have exchanged with one another and with the natural world since forever. Images, objects, and ideas, that is, cultural expressions, have helped establish and maintain these relationships transhistorically. Quoting Moore, "The economy and the environment are not independent of each other. Capitalism is not an economic system. It is not a social system. It is a way of organizing nature." Moore recognizes that what is unique about our time is that we act as though humans are outside of nature. It is almost as though Kant's ideas have affected our total worldview. Something has normalized the idea that we can be without paying any real ecological or social costs. This disconnectedness from the real world, a general lack of appreciating life's actually necessary central relationships with others, and an assumption that profit meets our needs, are some of the systemic causes of humanitarian crises. Art has a difficult time meaningfully intervening in this situation, and especially when it does not challenge these systemic terms. Photographer Sebastião Salgado's work is described in this way. Salgado's straightforward photographs portray individuals living in desperate economic circumstances. Salgado achieves a difficult task. His photographs impart the dignity and integrity of his subjects without forcing their heroism or implicitly soliciting pity. But everything, including interpretation, is particular and contextual. Without reading this text, any viewer's takeaway from this sort of image is up for grabs. Art is no better at interpreting or educating than any other cultural way of explaining the world. We know that climate change is somehow real, having read about it somehow being a cause for the recent Syrian civil war or all those migrants moving north from Central America. But we are still somehow not able to grasp that people live in actual exchange with everything around them, not just the bank and tax collector. This is important because it is these actual logistical systems we look through when we Google Salvadoran banana plantation. The abstract and real sense that we can organize nature without cost is made of plantations and mines, police, harbors and ports, trains, deep sea cables, but also the cultural idea that art is just a nice or meaningful thing, and culture, which is meaningful because that's what it is. Fine art benefits from the myth that it can uniquely change our understanding of the world. But in our abstract world, art is just a programmed space we can point to and say, look at art for meaning. In this way, it is a placeholder for felt misunderstanding, a desire for something more that only sometimes works. Theories that ground Western art suggest that its meanings are abstract and essentially universal. But everything is contextual. Much of what we call art is displayed at the end of a chain of mistakes, bad judgment, greed, and ill will that has been allowed to happen. To expect that this art can be impactful is to expect that a hand can easily catch a bullet. Because of our unreal appreciation of how we live, we have an unreal appreciation of our own lives and how it is that lives are structured. Communities rely on each other, and the more than human world, communities rely on each other and the more than human world for stability and flexibility they need to manage their affairs. This is ecological relation. Art can provide us a way to recognize the human ways in which we relate to each other as individual biological beings and an ecological exchange. When art can open us to ourselves and the world in ways that situate us as something other than passive viewers, it can situate meaning in the hungry, precarious, and sensuous body, rather than in some weirdly abstract world mind that Hegel suggests. Brazilian artist Ligia Clark, let me just make sure that the slide is there. Brazilian artist Ligia Clark's wearable sculpture, Máscara, her wearable sculpture helps focus the wearer's senses and highlights the interactiveness of human being. This work's effects are individual. It works intimately and a passive viewer misses out from the experience of actually wearing the contraption. To wear this work, or any artwork that asks us to really hear, smell, touch, see differently and play, is to feel something. While this kind of work has little to do with interventions in the political sphere and does nothing to address humanitarian problems, when paired with critical analysis, it can more reliably convey a sense of our individual actual being in the contingent world. Large-scale crisis can occur when, because of race, gender, poverty, or ways of being, humans deny others the right to manage their own affairs. Art can connect us to the general humanity of being in a variety of ways. For example, in the 1970s, feminist sound artist Paulina Oliveros began to create a music and art practice known as deep listening. In deep listening, attention is directed I'm quoting here, attention is directed to the interplay of sound and silences, or the sound-silence continuum. Sound is not limited to musical or speaking sounds, but is inclusive of all perceptible vibrations, where the perception of sound is understood to include the whole space-time continuum of sound, encountering the vastness and complexities as much as possible. Deep listening is an aesthetic practice made by modernist artists that have been utilized as an expansive socio-political practice. Other artists have used it as a method to deeply listen, to join with others, to deeply focus on the mundane but very real infrastructures that structure our lives. For example, through artist-led walks in the city, and to actually hear what we have built all around us. But beyond the confines of museum viewership or short-term engagements with cultural activity that can be left behind, there are artists and cultural workers that meaningfully collaborate within crisis situations. The sort of cultural work here that I'm interested is often partisan, as it finds its way to do meaningful work in conflicted and difficult situations. Crisis situations offer people in crisis their dilemma to learn from, and the possibility to co-organize ways out of it if allowed to do so. Artists and cultural workers can collaborate with people in crisis to stabilize precarious communities by providing space for needed interactions. Under both liberal and right-wing government, Denmark has incredibly stringent migration policy and houses refugee and asylum seekers far from population centers, minimizing their chances for cultural integration and maximizing mental health issues. Trampoline House was founded in Copenhagen as a place for foreigners and Danish residents to interact on a personal level, as a needed social outlet for refugees and Danes, as a way to generally transform Danish society, and to challenge, on the political level, racist narratives that dehumanize all migrants. Some of the asylum seekers that experienced Trampoline House fled the Syrian revolution that began in 2011. In northern Syria, following decades of oppression, Kurds and other peoples declared a free state to be governed under anarcho-syndicalist and feminist concepts. Within the context of this crisis, they took territory and have managed it as a precarious but autonomously governed state with roughly 2 million residents. Dutch artist Jonas Stoll funneled money from the Dutch Mondrian Fund for Arts to collaborate with the territory to design and build their parliament. Following the Trump administration's selling out of the Kurds in 2019, the commune was attacked by Turkish forces, and the fate of the multicultural democratic state is made even more unsure. But Stoll's collaboration has provided a culturally significant place where its residents have an opportunity to politically stabilize their community and possibly manage their affairs in open and democratic ways. But cultural workers have done more than provide shelter, housing, and cover for governing systems. Cultural work has the ability to create and entirely reimagine the terms under which displaced communities approach their living. This sort of work is culturally innovative in the sense that it crafts totally new ways to relate to the human and more than human world through cultural expressions, often with theological and political components. For example, the late 19th century Native American shaman named Wovoka hybridized indigenous spirituality and Christianity to create the ghost dance. The dance was spread by the new rail system in the American West, which was completed at the end of the country's colonial expansion. The dance created a new pan-native cultural expression. Though a peace movement under particular terms, Indigenous historian Nick Estes described it in this way. The ghost dance, in the revolutionary sense, was about life, not death. It was about imagining and enacting an anti-colonial indigenous future free from the death world brought on by settler invasion. The dance form Its music and costumes were co-invented by its practitioners in order to convey, in really meaningful ways, a redefinition of human being. Quoting again, the leader beat time and sang, and the people danced going round to the left in a sidewise step. They danced without rest, on, and they got out of breath, but still they kept going as long as possible. Occasionally, someone, thoroughly exhausted and dizzy, fell unconscious into the center and lay there, dead. After a while, many lay about in that condition. They were now dead and seeing their dear ones. As each one came to, woke up, she or he slowly sat up and looked about, bewildered. Had the dance been allowed to flourish, scholars suggest that North American indigenous communities may have been able to reinvent lifeways and avoid the multiple crises that indigenous communities have lived through, from the violent encounters at the end of the Plain Wars up until today. In closing, in the light of the coming climate-based dispossessions, I would suggest that there are artists and cultural workers collaborating with communities to meaningfully remake values in variable, radical ways that stick, and in relationship to the wider world, that can avoid the development of humanitarian crises by reigniting and redirecting how we meaningfully organize life and the ways and means of living together. So I'm going to stop share and say thank you for listening, and I'm excited to take on and answer any questions. Thank you. Stop.
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're well. My name is Gilles Furtwängler. I'm a poet and a visual artist living between Lausanne, Switzerland, and Johannesburg in South Africa. I'm here to invite you to participate in a collective artwork. I, myself, mainly work with words, text that I write, but also with found text, found words that I hear and read in my daily life. I then turn these sentences into poems to be read. They are also printed on posters or tarps, painted or turned into sculptures. I'm interested by writing and retelling what I hear, to give it back through art pieces. Our everyday words and thoughts, ways of speaking, of thinking, of learning, of evolving. For the ones who are interested to participate, I'm inviting you to share with me on a guest book page some of your notes, comments, or feedback on the topics presented today. Representing. To be more precise, I have 3 questions. What are your thoughts following today's presentations? How could you represent people in vulnerable situations in the place you are living today? What could be an artwork representing the memory of a trauma in your specific society? It's pretty simple to participate. You just need to click on this link and you will be directed to a page where you will be able to post your feedback and comments. My proposition is to build with your words a text around the topics of this symposium. The text will be then designed and published in the book following this symposium. Every contributor will be credited or can decide to stay anonymous. Feel free to give your feedback as if it was a guest book, an ID box, a common brainstorming, or a complaints office. It can be keywords, critical thoughts, long paragraphs, short ones, all is accepted. There is also a video uploading option for those who prefer to talk. I am really looking forward to discovering your contribution and working with them. I thank you very much for your participation. I'm wishing you a good afternoon. Thank you. The link below the video is available from now and will stay active until end of June 2021.
Good afternoon. My name is Isabelle and I'm going to present you with a paper entitled Why a Chair? Artistic Gestures as Acts of Memory and Reconstruction. And I'm just going to share my screen so that you can see the slides that I prepared for today. This paper examines the chair as an artistic gesture, as a way of addressing political violence and commemorating its victims. Chairs have the potential as symbolic objects to define relationships within society, if we think about kings, presidents, CEOs, etc. The seat becomes a symbol of authority and power. The artistic interventions I will describe in this paper use the chair as substitutes for the raw and violent images of the traumatic events they commemorate or embody. The chairs become intrinsic to memory. They provide a place where memory can be reenacted. They cross boundaries, although their primary function is not to bear the burden of these traumatic events. As Jenny Cass writes in her cultural study of a chair, and I quote, "Chairs have a unique potential among all of the available pieces of furniture to become more than the wood and glue of which they are comprised. The chair carries cultural baggage. The throne is royalty. The electric chair is crime and depravity. It has something to say both for the individual arriving in its restraints as for the society that demands its use." End of quote. There are, of course, other commemorations using chairs, such as the 2,753 chairs installed in September 2011 on the lawn at New York City's Bryant Park to mark the 10th anniversary of the World Trade Center disaster. I can also give you the example of the 168 chairs permanently installed to remember victims of the 1995 bombing of the A. Murray Federal Building in Oklahoma City. This paper examines how chairs, as part of artistic interventions, act as a metaphor of absence and memory. The chairs mediate, commemorate disruptive events of strife and violence as experienced by the population of a neighborhood, a city, or a country at large. This proposed overview departs from Daniel Berset's broken chair, which still stands on the Place des Nations in Geneva 23 years after being placed there to encourage the signature of the Ottawa Convention in December 1997. I will then move to the work of Colombian artist Doris Salcedo, with chairs and pieces of furniture, bearing witness to the Colombian Civil War and the silent disappearance of citizens during decades, before reflecting on Haris Pazovic's Sarajevo Red Line, an artistic act of commemoration in Sarajevo, marking the 20th anniversary of the start of the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Finally, I will examine Nada Senawi's installation back in 2008, Haven't 15 Years of Hiding in the Toilets Been Enough, in Marty Square, Beirut's historical city center. Violence is universal, omnipresent throughout our nations. The installations I will present you act as a kind of counter-memorials in face of a lack of closure by official discourses. The audience takes part in the act of remembering, taken as the new witnesses to the violence referred by the artworks and the way it inscribes itself in the space of a square or a street. There is no need to relate to the aesthetics of anthropomorphism to connect to these human traces, to a human suffering turned at the level of the individual victim. These often ephemeral monuments pay tribute to human beings who have been silenced and in which the space holds their memory. In each of these four artistic practices, the chair embodies an absence of a body, of victims, the fragility of a human body, and the invisibility of victims of war and violence. Yet the chair commemorates the social and human connection through the act of remembering collectively. As Edward Casey wrote in his Remembering, a phenomenological study, commemorating, and I'm quoting, commemorating also creates new forms of sociality, new modes of interconnection between past and present, self and other, one group and another, one form of thinking or acting or speaking and another, one sex and another, one art form and another. Commemorating does more than paying tribute to honorable actions undertaken in the past and at another place. It constructs the space and continues the time in which the commendably interhuman will be perduringly appreciated. End of quote. These artistic practices are very close to humanitarian efforts to give visibility to silenced victims, and this makes me think of Judith Butler's reflection on when is a life grievable, a question she elaborates upon in her book Frames of War. Humanitarians and NGOs act in the names of the victims, in defense of them, and their work is made of endless negotiation with all parties involved in a conflict and the non-respect of human rights. Their greatest achievements are the signature of a peace agreement or a convention to respect human rights. And I'm just going to move now to Broken Chair by Daniel Berset. When it was installed in August 1997 on the Place des Nations in Geneva, Daniel Berset, the broken chair, was meant to stay in place for 3 months. Geneva, and especially the Place des Nations, embody several meanings on an international, humanitarian, and universal level. It is a gathering place for causes linked to the UN and the defense of human rights, as well as a crossing point for public transportation. The chair stands on 3 feet, the fourth one significantly broken, alluding to the way anti-personal minds can maim people, but do not kill them, leaving these atrocious scars for life. The chair is of a universal symbolism. Even maimed, it is still able to stand on its remaining feet. Made of 5.5 tons of wood with a height of 12 meters, this chair embodies international and universal values. Daniel Berset conceived the piece after discussing it with Paul Vermeulen, the founder and director of Handicap International Switzerland. The artist had been working with chairs since 1977-1983, and these were representative of his work well before the installation of the broken chair on the Place des Nations. Daniel Berset gives his interpretation of a chair. The chair is an act of civilization, a way of speaking about human beings without disclosing them. It is not only an object of comfort and conviviality, but also of power. When I did collaborate with Handicap International, it seems essential to us not to illustrate violence, but to suggest it. Implied violence allows it to deepen further reflection. I would never have thought that this sculpture would disturb so much. End of quote. This strong image was an open call to all nations to definitely forbid the use of anti-personal mines by signing the Ottawa Convention. As Handicap International didn't communicate when the chair was placed in August 1997, and I quote, "The chair has to communicate through the symbol rather than through the raw and shocking image of a victim who has just been maimed by a mine, allows everyone to develop a personal reflection without rejecting the message." End of quote. It has remained in place until today, although in 2006, during the redevelopment of the Place des Nations, it was removed, leading to a prolonged debate on whether to keep it or not. The UN were reluctant to leave it there because it was considered that the symbol was too hard and disturbable. The city of Geneva was eventually able to impose it and have it resettled on the same place on the 26th of February 2007. Beyond the commemoration of victims of landmines in Angola and in several countries around the globe, it stands alone for mankind, for the suffering of others, and the perpetual fight for survival. In 2000, Daniel Berset had another installation with red chairs, Ligne Rouge, taking place on the Quai Wilson during a UN conference on the interdiction of anti-personal mines in Geneva. For the duration of the conference, which was 5 days and 4 nights, one broken chair painted in red would be placed on the quay every 20 minutes. Until this day, 42 countries have not signed the Ottawa Convention, among them 3 permanent members of the UN Security Council, China, the United States of America, and Russia. This installation is a much more permanent installation than the other artistic installations I will present now. And the second example I wanted to show you today is by Doris Salcedo. Doris Salcedo is a Colombian artist based in Bogota. Her work often involves political violence in Colombia into abstract artworks that bear witness to loss and suffering. The state of emergency in Colombia has not raised much official national attention, whereas people kept disappearing without a trace for many decades. The state of loss and violence has afflicted the country since the late 1940s through abductions and executions. As Doris Salcedo states, and I quote, "In all of my work, I have addressed only one issue, political violence. Because I strongly believe that violence defines the ethos of our society. I have focused on political violence not simply because I am Colombian, which in a way gives me a deeper and close knowledge of its effects, but because it is more than 60 years in constant war." End of quote. Hence, Salcedo constitutes a fragile memory of the missing. The chair she uses marks the absence of a human body, its fragility, an absent and silent presence. Salcedo, who has worked mainly with domestic ready-made furniture such as beds, armoires, and chairs since 1984, produced a series of installations that, according to Claudette Lawson, and I quote, capture both the mutilating, dehumanizing nature of political violence and the domestic, deeply intimate consequences of civil strife. End of quote. Salcedo took part to the 8th International Istanbul Biennale in 2003 with a powerful, meaningful installation in the neighborhood of Karaköy. It consisted of 1,550 wooden kitchen chairs piled between two buildings at Yemenici Kadesi 66. The pile of chairs reached the 3rd floor of the building and seemed rather unstable, ready to collapse at any time. Salcedo had previously used the motif of a chair for 2 installations. Tenebre, November 6, 1985, at the Camden Art Centre in London in 2002, and November 67 at the Palace of Justice in Bogota, also in 2002. Here you just have a detail of her installation at the Istanbul Biennale, when you can see actually the way the chairs were piled up on one another. November 6 and 7 refers to the 1985 storming of the Colombian High Court by M19 guerrillas. The siege and battle, which killed over 100 people, left 70 people missing, and the building in flames. I will describe it as a 2-day performance taking place in Bogota, on the facade of the Palace of Justice, the exact same place where the events unfolded in 1985. It commemorates the 54 hours of the siege and battle. This particular event is highly contested in Colombian history until today. Although most historical accounts concur that over 100 people died during the military assault on the palace, Salcedo relies on a source quoting 280 victims for her installation, offering her own interpretation of these events. And you will see that there will be 280 chairs hanging from the roof on the facade of the Palace of Justice. Salcedo commemoration, a little bit like Daniel Bercy Red Line, try to measure the duration and the skill of a siege by a slow lowering of the chairs, sliding them down the facade of the Palace of Justice. The wooden chairs were slowly suspended against the facade of a newly reconstructed building from different points on the roofs. At the end of the performance, the 280 chairs were transforming the unity of a facade into a cacophony of empty chairs. And I can show you the way it unfolded during the 2 days here. With his highly specific performance, Salcedo tried to reconcile, through an ephemeral work of art, the raw facts. She did not differentiate the casualties between victims and perpetrators, guerrillas, soldiers, and hostages. All got the same attention from the artist as victims of this tragic event, in a shared gesture of commemoration. Of course, the chairs here resonate with the absent bodies of the victims, and Salcedo articulates her choice of the chairs as follows, and I quote, "The empty chairs are statements of absence, allowing one to be aware of the fragility of those who were behind those walls 17 years ago. Exposed and suspended on the stone facade, the empty chair emphasizing the vulnerability, not only of those who worked in the Palace of Justice, but of us all. This piece is vulnerable from within and unprotected on the exterior." End of quote. In such spaces of mournful commemoration, as in Salcedo's work, chairs occupy a purpose of rendering the absent body a palpable present, a metonym for their disappearance. And I'm moving now to my third example today, which is Sarajevo Red Line. And Sarajevo Red Line was a commemoration for the 11,541 victims of a siege in Sarajevo, which took place on the 6th of April 2012, marking the 20th anniversary of the beginning of the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Known as the longest siege in modern history, the siege of Sarajevo lasted for 1,425 days. Sarajevo Red Line was designed by film and theatre director Haris Pajovic to pay homage to the victims in a powerful yet simple way. Pajovic placed these red plastic chairs around in 825 rows on Titova Street, the main street of the city center. Most poignant were the 643 little chairs suggesting the children who fell victims of the siege. Screens were displayed along the installation, scrolling the names of the victims by alphabetical order, 1 second for each name, the whole list lasting for up to 3 hours, and a stage was closing the entire installation. Artists from the Sarajevo Opera performed for 1 hour on stage, a concert for those who could not attend, as Pajovic explains. The installation of chairs formed an auditorium, but deprived its audience. The viewers could not come because they were dead. There was this present absence or absent presence. End of quote. In a city where every inhabitant lost a relative, a friend, or a neighbor, passers-by connected to this commemoration and interacted by choosing a chair for their loved ones, bringing flowers in their way to pay tribute to them. Children brought toys and teddy bears. Their parents could explain the siege to them through this abstract visualization rather than through its images of violence. The initial shock and grief turned into some kind of grace and love. Sarajevo Red Line was meant to be an ephemeral, temporary way of setting up a memorial in the public space. The city got together in a very unusual way to commemorate the dead, because there was no space for the living in this installation. As a theatre director, Pajovic is used to work in an empty theatre, with the actors on stage during rehearsals. The idea of a chair came from the meaning of his empty seats, which will one day be occupied and the theatre full of life during official representations. In 1997, at the end of the war, during the first pop concert which took place in the city center, Pajovic realized how much lives and how many lives 10,000 people represent. And he also realized the absence of a victim of a siege and the meaning of his absence to the daily life of a city. Psychologist Julliard and her colleagues called the power of artistic commemoration while investigating Sarajevo Red Line and its effects on a fractured society. Sarajevo Red Line and this effect to connect together people on an international level, even people who were not even Bosnians or familiar with the siege of Sarajevo. The press coverage and an unprecedented and unexpected effect, with media from virtually everywhere reporting on this overwhelming event. Sarajevo Red Line is about how to represent memory in an ever-shifting society. Pajovic himself does not consider his authorship important. His own role is so small compared to the scale of the commemoration. He's very humble about it, saying the commemoration is much bigger than an individual artistic gesture. This is an example of an individual action which contributes to collective memory and public commemoration. The last example I chose to present today took place in Beirut, the capital city in Lebanon, in 2008. This time, it is not a commemoration to the dead, but to the livings and their coping mechanism during the war. We are all aware of the everlasting state of violence and conflict which has prevailed in the country since the 1970s and the recent events which unfolded since October 2019. Lebanese artist Nada Senawi had the idea not to install chairs, but toilet seats on Marty Square, a meaningful and strategic location for all inhabitants, a no man's land during the war where only militia could enter. Untitled, Haven't 15 years of hiding in the toilets been enough? The installation was put in place for 2 weeks, and the Beiruti could interact with them by coming to Marty Square, sitting down and listening to readings or performances during this time. The toilet seats were used as chairs, but despite their awkwardness, these seats had a real signification, embodying fears and threats that the inhabitants of Beirut had to endure during the war. Like staircases or basements, toilets and bathrooms were a place to which one could seek refuge and hide during the shelling on the city. These rooms are often devoid of windows, but it was also the place when one could give way to his or her emotional state, to these feelings of solitude and discouragement. In the face of the Lebanese conflict, individuals had no impact on the unfolding of events and their duration, and they just had to endure them and hope for the best, as they used to say. So now we did write a text on sitting down back in 2001, reflecting on a population in the waiting, in desperate need for a change and for resuming a normal life one day. And you have this text here. When I was 15, I sat down. It was not to study, because there was no electricity. It was not to flirt. The school was closed. It was to wait. Hours, days, weeks. I was not allowed to sit down. In the corridors, the bathrooms, basements, elevator cases, we sat by thousands. Hours, days, weeks. This installation, for the Lebanese youth, for those who are no longer here, so that memory can transmit itself. This text was written by Senawi. The same year she did another installation, Promenade in Your Dream, with 50 chairs at the International College in Beirut. It was a participative installation during which students could write or draw a reply to one basically simple but also difficult question, which was, what would be the school of your dreams? Chairs and text were placed in an open-air amphitheater, replacing a human audience, this time again. And I'm just coming to an end with a conclusion. The 4 artistic practices I have presented today share some elements, although they all emerge in a very specific, often local context. Their suggestion of absence, of the void, are a direct allusion to the human presence and to mankind. Such absent corporeal themes allow the audience to connect to their own personal experience of loss. These artistic gestures challenge the usual temporary and physical frameworks which characterize public commemoration. There is a sense of universality in these installations, all departed from individual, private initiatives, in a will to escape official modes of memorialization through the impermanence of time and space. Berset, Salcedo, Pazovic, and Senawi created a fragile, temporary framework that the audience needed to acknowledge in some way. They suggested a narrative of a reconstruction of violent events rather than imposing the official narrative of history. Their art shows how architecture of a city, of a square, or of a building can become the container of state violence and can be later turned into a site of conciliation and commemoration. This paper was not only on power, vulnerability, hope, and despair. It is about mankind's place in the world and the humanitarian intervention, without which, more often than not, commemoration cannot take place, because these traumatic events are not acknowledged as such by official local state discourse. As Maurice Halbwachs wrote in his collective memory, and I quote, "Memory reconstructs an image of a past in accord with the predominant thoughts of a society," end of quote. These artists try to suggest the reconstruction of an image according to a society, a population's remembers, and not from the state official notion of remembering. You would have noticed that some of the chairs I did speak about today were painted or produced in red. Red, the color of blood. Red, also the color of life. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
International Committee of the Red Cross. I'll be your moderator, host for this Q&A sessions with the speakers. I'm very pleased and I was very impressed by the paper presented. And let me introduce quickly who is online. So we have first Isabelle Delecourt, who just presented the paper on chairs. We have Dominique Laleg and Marc Herbst, who gave also some insight about the question of representation. And I think a few of the questions will go around that. I'm also joined by Pascal Schmidt, the director of the International Red Cross Red Crescent Museum. And I think Enckell Julliard, the director of the cultural development of the School of Art and Design, HEAD here in Geneva, should be around. If not, she will join very soon. So thanks everyone for this very interesting insights. And maybe I can start with a question, if you don't mind, which relates to indeed the question of representation. As a member of a humanitarian organization which was born on a piece of art which was very much depicting the situation on the battlefield, the Memory of Solferino, written by Henri Dunant, that led to the creation of the Red Cross Red Crescent movement, but also led to the creation of international humanitarian law, also the so-called Geneva Convention. And an organization and the whole sector has used a lot of very illustrative images, illustrative piece of art to try to advocate, to push for decision, for changes, for an impact for people. I saw a kind of a divergence or convergence, I don't know how we can put it, in the way we should today, or we could today, represent suffering. So my question relates to how, as a humanitarian organization, we can have an impact still, but without adding to the somehow feeling of misery, of helpless that people can see feel when they see pictures of suffering on the other side of the world. So maybe, I don't know, Isabelle, if you want to start, because your presentation was about the non-representation of people, but still trying to illustrate the suffering, the absence. So maybe if you want to start, and then I can hand over to Dominique or Marc.
Yes, thank you very much. I would say, of course, the presentation, everything was depersonalized, but our imagination is working. And the suffering is first an individual experience and then a collective experience. If you take the example of Sarajevo and Beirut, it's the experience of one person, one family, one area, and then a city or a country at large. And when I was doing, I conducted a lot of research in both Bosnia and Herzegovina and Lebanon. And people don't have, of course, the same approach to suffering. They don't bear witness. They speak about it. It's a very difficult exercise for them. But the the way they're going to tell about it could be extremely different, and also extremely different given the several geographical parts where they live during a given event or so on. And for me, it's a little bit to use a symbol like the chair, or it could be something else. It's much more powerful because our imagination is working on it. Just a very simple comparison here. When you read a book and then you watch a movie, maybe 1 or 2 years later, you're always in a way disappointed because it doesn't connect to what you imagine in terms of characters, settings, landscapes, and so on. And in some way, you know that Adorno said that after Auschwitz, one couldn't actually speak about suffering, and there was this unsayable. So it's also, in terms of my research, I work very much with highly political works of art, but which are totally depersonalized.
Thanks. Dominique or Marc, I see you are unmuted. Do you want to react to that?
Yeah, I'd be willing to. I find the question very interesting, and I can't, knowing the Red Cross's role as an amazing organization, Red Crescent's role as an amazing organization, cleaning up messes of global messes. I don't mean this cynically. I see this as an ethical question. Credibility and the ethical role that it plays in this highly in our global structure. And so I don't, while I find what Isabelle said to be very interesting, the particular, just her whole presentation, I think that we can divorce the question of we can divorce questions around representing suffering from on a global scale from the suffering of people in place. And I wonder to the extent how this question remains meaningful in relationship to who and how the Red Cross is as an institution, who does depict suffering in order to maintain its very useful and very needed position globally in a governance regime.
Mm-hmm. I'll react to that after, but I clearly want to leave Dominique if you have a point on that.
I agree very much with what Marc just said, and also Isabelle, and I was very impressed about Isabelle's contribution. At some point, she mentioned something that I found crucial in regard to your question, Philippe. So you said, Isabelle, in regard to these installations, there is a sense of universality. That's what you said. There's a sense of universality. So I personally think that this is the crucial point. It seems that there are different sorts of universality. One could be called a false universality. That is what Marc also has criticized in his paper and what I basically did. Like the universality of a very abstract idea of freedom, a very abstract idea of the self that we have inherited from Enlightenment. But on the other hand, there is a sort of good universality, if you want so, that can be achieved by aesthetic means. And this is probably the main challenge for an institution like yours, how to achieve this sort of good universality by aesthetic means. I don't have an answer for this. I think there isn't a general answer, but I think it's a question, the crucial question that people who work on this sort of institutions, as you do, can keep in mind.
I don't know, Pascal, who is working also on a project about what is the humanitarian gesture, or how humanitarian gesture has gone or evolved through the history of photography. Do you want to react to that, or well, I'm sure you have something to say.
Well, first of all, big thank you also from me to all the speakers. It's a fascinating topic and a very complex one. I couldn't agree more with you, Marc, to say that everything is complex when you start looking at it in details, actually. And I think as an institution, as a museum that is related to the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, we have a responsibility, even a greater one, to empower our visitors to question what they see and to keep sharp and open about the representations of suffering and many other things. What Philippe is referring to is a project I'm currently working on with my team and curator Nathalie Herstoffer on visual grammar of humanitarian action through history that we are researching in a huge collection of photographs kept by the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement here in Geneva, millions of images. And we're trying through this visual heritage to understand what visual grammar has evolved, how it keeps repeating itself, and how it informs ongoing representations of humanitarian action everywhere and all the time. So deconstructing the representation is of the essence to me, and I would be very curious to hear you, Isabelle, Dominique, and Marc on how a cultural institution as a museum can actually be an agent in this specific area. But first, perhaps, Philippe, you would want to respond to Marc's point and Dominique's about universality, and you wanted to raise a point there.
Sure. Yeah, there is, I think, something which resonates is indeed the question of universality, the undisputed universality. I will say, in the sense that we know that suffering is represented or is lived in a different way according to culture. We don't express the same way the way we suffer, depending on which country you are from, which culture you come from. So I'm still having this problem somehow, this dilemma of matching between the so-called undisputed suffering, the ethical element of not abusing the suffering of others, but still, however, having the pragmatic approach. And here I will go further than what Marc mentioned in terms of it's about reputation or fundraising. I will put this a little bit on the side, which I agree there is this dimension, but for us, it's also when we speak in front of the UN General Assembly, or when we speak to government, or when we speak to groups, for example, is to try to explain and play with the humanity that these people have in trying to push them to respect civilians or not kill children and so on. So it's these dilemmas of the usage, if I can say, with the impact, but without abusing the suffering of others. So I don't know, I put it here, and I don't know if you want to react. Who wants to go first? Marc, I see you moving.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say. I was moving in relationship to, I'm sorry, don't have your name at the moment, gentleman who just spoke before you, who's doing this interesting archive collection. Pascal. And so the question of deconstructing representation, I guess it also relates to your point. I think it's an amazing question. In my talk, what I was hinting at was I pointed to two things that I think relate. I talk about, first of all, situating the central body in relation to a contingent world, that so as to understand that pain matters and that suffering matters, not only in the world, but in myself and in my relations, but then also in the non-egocentrical way, and understanding how its relationship to global governance, understanding, literally deconstructing what produces the image, as you're talking about as well, I think, in terms of, as I talked about, the change in logistics that allow for particular ways of being to be. So how the production of the global order through its logistical change and networks of meaning and also of real goods and of laws and orders structure a reality that is constructed. So to deconstruct and to identify and situate suffering in a real and meaningful way that that can escape the confines of a predetermined grammar that has not yet been able to find meaning so as to describe and contain violence. The deconstructive process would also open up our construction of an understanding of how the construction of the world happens and comes to be, so as to enliven the world with enlightened connectivity and an understanding and appreciation of our necessary embeddedness in a global order which is not perfect and is violent and violently maintained, that the Red Cross attempts to deal with.
I see that Julie has joined us, and sorry if I didn't see you earlier, but welcome, Julie. I don't know if you wanted to react, or shall we give the floor to Pascal to react?
No, I'm very happy. Thank you all for all this conference. It was fascinating, and listening to you all, I was thinking that this deconstruction of the archives of the Red Cross, which is the next project of Pascal, is absolutely central and essential. But it makes us think of this desire of deconstructing our perception of the humanitarian action through internet and the globalization. So it's a never-ending story, and I was just thinking that, to me, as a former museum director, but of course in another context, the main problem was the diversity of the points of view in a museum. And I like very much the way Pascal puts it when he speaks about his projects. He says he speaks always of a conversation. And this sets a plurality of points of view. And this is, I think, the main, the basis of kind of a humility and diversity and inclusivity in our perception of the humanitarian action. So I just wanted to say that. But.
Okay.
Thank you, Julie.
Maybe before Pascal you go on, I just wanted to be sure that Isabelle or Dominique want to add something, so that we still give a little bit of the floor to our guests.
No, I just wanted to say, as an institution based in Switzerland regarding humanitarian action, it's very important, as you are doing at the moment, to give access to testimonies and to bear witness, because of course we live outside the context of violence. We are normally, the people here, we are not direct victims of violence. So it's more really to transmit testimonies and to bear witness about what's going on somewhere else. And then it's very difficult to find the proper way of actually disclosing or representing it. So that's the whole difficulty for your institution.
Yeah, I agree with that, and also I found the term deconstructing, of course, very somehow at center of the whole process we're talking about. So deconstruction is actually something that, if you want, so from a philosophical point of view, it started with decolonization. So in the 1960s, we have that moment where this great narrative somehow starts to crack. And it was people like Derrida himself, a Jewish Algerian, who left Algeria in the 1950s, basically during the war, and to start this sort of destruction. And since then, it's something very, very ongoing, as Julie says, and it causes huge challenges. And as I try to underline a bit that aspect of identities, which is also somehow caused by this continuous deconstruction. And there's a thing, when preparing that talk, I found Susan Sontag's book on suffering also very inspiring. And there's a point where she says, well, for the warrior, identity is everything. So I think that is something to keep in mind. So when it comes to especially ongoing conflicts, as we see them now again in Palestine, in Israel, and Lebanon, for these people, identity is everything. So you can show suffering, but it's crucial for them who is depicted, in what way, and by whom. And in this sense, I totally agree with what Julie said, basically perspectivism. Who is showing, who is talking, from what perspective, on what topic. I think that is a very good approach also to counter maybe this sort of cancel culture, identity politics, who has also a very destructive element often. And this sort of perspectivism seems to be what we need.
So now that's the perfect transition to you, Pascal. We have added a little bit so you can even more react to that. Perspectivism, is it the next?
Well, I have a question to all of you. I very much believe in this idea that we have to acknowledge structures in place, grammars in place, acknowledge who is telling the story and from what perspective. And once you're aware of that, embracing this diversity, my question to you is whether you think that accessing this complexity and acknowledging all of this might then be empowering to actually feel you can have a certain agency and that you can do something, or you can have your own perspective and have your own point of view. What I'm trying to do with my team is really move from the spectacular and showing and representing to actually breaking it down to something that might make sense to you as a viewer, because you've understood the complexity and you feel suddenly that you're part of a much broader conversation. I'm especially thinking about you, Marc, because in your presentation, I felt that and correct me if I misunderstood you, but there was a strong divide between art and artists and cultural players actively engaged in the field as agents, and another sphere which would be that of looking at art, appreciating it in a different context which would not be the field. So I'm curious to hear you talk about this idea of agency. How can a museum goer here in Switzerland, in Geneva, feel a sense of agency with regard to the representation of suffering? Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, and I think what you noticed is in the talk was true, though I had as a bridge the section around Lydia Clark's work, which is between a disembodied viewer and then the active viewer, and then the collaboration between artists and communities. But the question that I'd like to bring to you, and I think my other panelists also have something to say about this, is not only about a sense of agency, but then a question of actual agency. Like, what is the space between sensing one's agency and actually being able to do something? And what is the ways in which a museum, in that my talk was about empowering communities to actually take action and build their capital buildings and or create new religions and ways of being. To what extent can any institution facilitate other ways of being to collaboratively produce agency that is real and meaningful and not just a speculative feeling?
Yeah,
which is important.
Of course, I guess the agency is relative to where it is expressed and where it takes place. I mean, is agency just as relevant within your community, wherever you are? Does it have to be related to humanitarian catastrophes? I'm not sure, because it cannot be. I mean, not everybody who goes to a museum can suddenly feel agency to solve a war or to solve a humanitarian crisis, but you can perhaps reflect upon what your choices and decisions on a daily basis what kind of impact they have around your community, which is real to you in your situation. I don't know how you think about that, Isabelle, Dominique, or even Julie, in the context of training and being constantly in relationship with artists who perhaps ask themselves these questions too. Dominique, perhaps?
Well, for me, I mean, we were talking about agency. I found it quite difficult because the concept of agency can be very diverse. I mean, I thought about actually the term of aesthetic agency and what that would be like. But it's a bit difficult because as Isabelle showed us, a crucial potential of these artworks is actually not so much to intervene in a concrete world, but eventually to constitute community, first of all. So before acting as a community, you need somehow to have a community. And that is something where I think aesthetics has, of course, great potential. And I mean, we take it for granted that it's part of our community building, part of nation building in an ideological way often also. And yeah, the question is, because we were talking about universality, how universal can this community be? So who is addressed, who is visible, who is not visible? This seems to be like the difficulty before it comes to agency. I personally think that's where aesthetics has a crucial role, or art has a crucial role as a mean of community building.
Did you observe that, Isabelle, in your research? Was that a key aspect of what you observed?
I think what they all told me was the difficulty to get permission to have their installation in the public space. You know, regarding just this were highly political places in Bogota, in Sarajevo, and in Beirut. And just the way they had not to trick, but really to push their municipalities to have a right to do these installations already says something, you know. And I think even here in Geneva, you cannot just call up the city and say, hello, I have an installation, I want to do it on Place des Nations tomorrow. So the creativity is between several artists, but it doesn't, you know, not every artist is actually allowed or doesn't have the way to get the permission to install it where he wants or she wants it to be installed. And I think this is really what I observed, that these artists are already very well known, and so it facilitates this aspect. But many others would have something to say and something to install in these very specific places. And the harbor of Beirut, I think you saw that there was a sculpture installed, and the artist doesn't belong to the mainstream of the Beiruti artists. So once again, we were interrogating how this could happen. We have an idea, of course, but there were several other monuments who really deserve to be placed there as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think what is difficult is that the street is the place of the democratic debate. And so it is a fascinating space where artistic projects spontaneously take place when needed. I mean, with such of an emergency, I mean, it has to be, you need a place to express something, and you do it, and it's enough space, and it's not without any authorization of the government or whatever. And in the opposite, there is the museum, and this very quiet, safe place where you can, you know, visit this history of all these projects. So this articulation is very much is a kind of a challenge, because in this street projects, a lot of things are said and happen, you know, and it's very and it's hard, of course, but in a way it says a lot about what is happening and how art can be an agent in a conflict situation. And so that my question as a conservator, as a curator, is how can you tell something about this in a museum? Yeah, what is the discourse and also the forms? Is it a round table with some speakers? Is it, do you have videos because everything is filmed now? Do you have, I don't know, witnesses? Is it through journalists? How can we work on it and be the most accurate in telling this story? I don't have the answer.
I'm afraid we will have to leave it here with all these questions. I think first I want to thank all of you, but it goes really in the direction of what Julie, Pascal, and I had in mind when we were organizing and starting to think about such a project, that this is just a first step or a second step towards trying to bring closer these different fields of expertise. And we could go on. We speak about representation, but what about the act of memory? We can speak about anticipation. There are many aspects within the art world that has a link with humanitarian action, with museums, with schools, and so on. So I think it encourages us to continue to work. I think we are very much looking forward to build on that and try to further explore these different fields. Clearly, next week we have another session which is very exciting too, with three very interesting speakers. We'll have very likely a publication that will summarize that, and I hope this is also a conversation that will carry on. To conclude, beyond saying again thank you to everyone, to the viewers, but also to our three speakers, Isabelle, Dominique, and Marc. Please don't hesitate and don't forget to participate to the collaborative art piece that Gilles Furtwängler has mentioned. I think it's a unique opportunity to be part of a project which has no intention. It's just a white card. So we, the spectators, the speakers, the organizer, will shape it the way we want somehow. So let's try to take advantage of that and see what comes out of it. Our collective intelligence will maybe make some interesting art piece, a new art piece that we can debate later on. So with these words, thanks again, and talk to you. I'll see you very soon here or there.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.